Welcome to Moms for America. So glad to have everyone here on this St. Patrick's Day. My name is Julene Jackson. I'm a mother of 5 children, ages 26 on down to 13. I was saying earlier how we were frantically trying to find some green for the 13-year-old before she got off to school today. But I live in the Chevy Chase, Maryland area, just about 15 minutes from Washington, D.C. So, I am right in the thick of a lot of things, living so close to the Capitol and to all the branches of government. Girls, we are halfway through our seminar. We have completed Seminar 1 and Seminar 2, and now we are on the first lesson of the attacks on the Charter of Freedom. So we have got 8 weeks under our belt, 8 more weeks to go. Remember, Seminar 1 was all about God's hand in building of America, the miracles of America, starting with little Joan of Arc in France and Christopher Columbus and the Pilgrims, the Revolutionary War, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, the miracle of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin's prayer. I love that seminar because it reminds me that God is a miracle. God is a God of miracles. And that even when it looks like we're on the brink of, no return, we know that he has come through before in the past. And as we study history, as we study scripture, we know that he is not going to leave us high and dry if we are petitioning him. And enough of us are praying to him, he will come forth. And he will heal this land, and this nation shall endure. And the beautiful Seminar 2, we study the Constitution from the intentions, the viewpoint of the founding fathers. They said this document was struck off by the hand of God. So how many articles do we have in the Constitution, girls? Put up your hands. How many articles? 7. How many amendments? 27. How many amendments did our founding fathers give us? 12. So 10, the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights, but they also gave us Amendment 11 and 12. And then those amendments 13 through 27 some of them have really undermined what our founders gave us. And we talked a little bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in section 3 of Seminar 3 of this seminar. So, we don't have to worry about who's going to win here. God is going to win, I always say, children, you mostly need to be concerned about whose side that you're on. You need to stay in relationship with God and be praying and be studying. I love, I'm going to start using it again. I've used this before. It's called the Bible Stories, and it has all the great stories of the Bible using all the language from the Bible, but it just pulls out the actual story. And you can so it has the story of Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Ruth and Samuel and Elisha and Ezra and the birth of Jesus when he's baptized, Peter. Anyways, so I'm going to start teaching and they're just about a page or two. And in my morning devotional with my 13-year-old, just to kind of knock out the stories. So she's familiar with these great stories in the Bible. So I've had this and I put it away for a time, but I'm going to pull it out again and use it. I think you can get this on the Moms for America site. If not, there's always Amazon. But so, as we mamas are kind of, and grandmas are starting to feel the fiery darts of the world penetrate into our home, and that kind of umbrella of protection that the Constitution has given homes and families for so many years, we're waking up and we're worried. Now, I always say, mothers and grandmothers, don't worry if your husband or your teenagers or your Gen Z kids or your millennials or your grandchildren are Gen Zs, if they're kind of like scratching their head thinking that, your opinion, your ideas are wrong. They are a product of coming up under this educational system that we have and we've had for the last 100 years. And so it's no wonder that they are often some key themes So let's be patient with these kids, or these adult children, these grandchildren in our life that might not agree with some of the things that you're learning, or even teaching or telling them that you're learning. You know, I've learned through the years. I have a 26, 23, 21, 17, 13. Some of my older kids, we would battle back and forth. Actually, last summer I had two children tell me they were going to vote for Joe Biden. And I thought, oh my land, they've come from the home that they've come from. What are they thinking of? But they are very much a product, as they went off to college, some of their liberal instructors and social media that, kids are so tied to today. And my one boy who's in the NBA, I think all the basketball players took a pact to vote for Kanye West. And so he told me he was voting for Kanye. And I remember we all went to the beach this summer. And I thought, me and my husband were thinking, where did we go wrong, as we had some wild conversations on the beach. But, I learned to just kind of inhale and ask God to soften my heart when I felt like throttling them, when they were saying some things that were so contrary to how they had been taught and how mom and dad believed. And sure enough, as I focused on trying to keep them close and to preserve that relationship, and just, to continue to share with them in a non-threatening way things that would come across my desk, or I would share with them some of the things that Dad and I were doing. Sure enough, the girls came around, and now they are the biggest advocates for some of the things that they were taught, years ago. And even my son has realized Kanye's not doing so well right now. And he actually called Dad last week. This is the kid, he was on the road in between games. He was in his hotel room and he said, Dad, I'm reading this really good book from Dale Carnegie on how to win friends and influence people. And he said that we should study great leaders. He's like, Dad, what's a good book about Abraham Lincoln that I could read? Just this last summer, he was trying to tell us how our founders were racist and bigoted, and now he's wanting to read a book on Abraham Lincoln. So I have learned that if we just don't overreact to some of the wild things that our kids might spew at us, but we just stay the course and we keep learning and studying and sharing with them, it will prick their hearts and they will remember how they have been taught. So, the most important thing, girls, is we continue to learn and to show up, and God will reward us for our efforts. He'll reward us personally, he'll reward our families, and it will justify the heavens to begin to intervene in our homes and in our communities. So girls, today let's turn to the introduction, section 1 of seminar 1. And it talks about the attacks of the Charter of Freedom. It really could be subtitled The Unhinging of America. And, we don't, until we know how something has been broken, we don't really know how to fix it. And so the greatness of America is very much a viable reality. But this mighty door, which kind of has been set in place to guard America's greatness, has become dangerously unhinged. And it's kind of just awkwardly ajar there. And so the founders designed 4 strong hinges to keep America's door strong. And the first hinge we're going to talk about is our education system. And then next week, we'll talk about the moral and ethical society that they intended for us to live under. And then the Constitution as they intended, and the attacks against it. And we talked a little bit about that in seminar 2. And then how we were supposed to, our founders intended us to be a light to the world, to be a model nation and not a dictator. And so these 4 hinges have been what has been the real strength of America. And so those will be the 4 sections that we'll cover in the attacks of the Charter of Freedom. So you will see that our little door is in need of a repair job. And so we're going to study how this has transpired. And then seminar 4 gives us ideas and the way, really, to heal America. So let's turn now to the very first section entitled The Tax on the Founders' Educational Dream. The founders emphasized, so girls, I hope that you're studying and filling in the blanks before we come to class each week, or for sure after we have our class. If you will study within 48 hours of something you've learned, you will retain it more. So here we go. The founders emphasized that the key to the survival of this new government that they gave us would be based on universal education. And in the 5,000-year leap, the 23rd principle said that in order for a free people to survive under a Republican Constitution, we must have a broad program of general education to remind them of the brilliance and the beauty of this new form of government that they had instituted here. So they knew that this great blessing of this new country would be lost, this new form of government would be lost unless we educated our citizenry from generation to generation. Because at that time, the ideal of universal education was completely unique to the world. Mostly only the ruling elite classes throughout the world were educated. For instance, when John Adams went over to France, when he was the ambassador in the 1770s, he was shocked to learn that out of the 24 million French people, only 500,000 could read and write. And so our founding fathers completely rejected this idea that only the upper class should have access to books and learning. And Thomas Jefferson himself said, no other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness except to preach a crusade against ignorance, establish and improve the law for educating the common people. So we're going to talk today about two cycles of education. The first cycle is so beautiful, and that's the beauty of what transpired within 100 years of our Constitution. And then the second cycle that occurred in about the 1850s and has kind of taken us up to where we are now. So let's first study this first cycle of education, starting from when the folks landed at Jamestown in 1607 until about the mid 1830s. So there was a real goal of excellence that began to transpire just after a few decades of people arriving here in this new world. In 1646, in fact, over 130 graduates from Oxford and Cambridge and Dublin universities immigrated to America. And so you began to see this discipline of an education beginning to take root. And in fact, John Adams, he was the second president of the United States, his son, John Quincy Adams, who would go on to become, I think, the fifth president, he talks about him being so proficient in the different languages and the classics and literature. And even we know Samuel Adams, who was John Adams' cousin, who was known as the father of the Revolutionary War. He started Harvard at 14, and Thomas Jefferson went to college at 16, William and Mary, and went on to law school at 18. And remember, for 5 years, he studied 12 to 14 hours a day. When he graduated from law school, it was said he knew more about the law than the men that examined him for his bar examination. And so during this period in the 1700s, there was really a direct responsibility placed on American parents to make sure that their children received the best education possible. And in the late 1700s, they began to see the fruits of freedom under the new laws of the Constitution that were being put into place. And Noah Webster, one of our founding fathers, he was a member of Congress in Connecticut. And he also is known for that famous Webster Dictionary. He said, all government originates in families, and if neglected there, it will hardly exist in society. The foundation of all free government and of all social order must be laid in the families and in the discipline of youth. The education of youth is an employment of more consequence than making laws and preaching the gospel, because it lays the foundation upon which both the law and the gospel rest for success. And Noah Webster, he would go on to be the author of spellers that were teaching children how to read and write and spell. And he would be used for 5 generations to teach children these things. And so Daniel Webster, did I call him Noah Webster? It's Daniel Webster. He said that children were to be taught these basic foundational beliefs in the family, or to be tutored by the best minds that the family could find. The Puritans in 1646 actually enacted a law, if you can imagine that the children must be well read enough to understand religious principles and capital laws. And then in the 1700s, you saw this demand by parents in Boston for little trainers and readers. 130 editions of spelling books and 332 different primary readers were being printed during this period. And most children were able to read, were homeschooled in home. They knew how to read before they actually entered school. Can you imagine that in the 1700s, the early 1800s? And so also it's been noted there that young children typically in the homes would learn to read and master their little phonics and their little letters by reading passages from the Bible. I remember my mama, she grew up on a farm deep in the country of Missouri in the 1930s, and she said she remembers her parents reading to them out of the Bible. And this is how she attributes her learning how to read. And so over 100 million copies of these little spelling books by Daniel Webster were being printed at that time. And all these books, interesting enough, contain spiritual rhymes and biblical principles in these readers and spelling books. And then have you ever heard of the McGuffey readers? William McGuffey. And look, here are my readers. I have them, girls. By 1836, a wonderful gifted teacher produced a set of educational primers, little readers, which included aspects of high moral character and God-oriented principles. And these readers contain the basics in reading, writing, arithmetic, how to be a good speaker. They also had the basics of literature, art forms, nature, history, how to be a good citizen, physical hygiene, and also how to respect your elders. Now, these readers place a really strong emphasis on spiritual values as well. So in these readers, McGuffey would glean references and include references to the 10 Commandments, the Golden Rule, and little biblical stories in their readers that kids would learn how to read from. And wouldn't you know, these McGuffey readers in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, over 120 million copies were printed, and they sold more than any other publication at that time except for the Bible and Webster's Dictionary. And so parents and the communities were expecting, when they sent their kids off to school, that the teachers would drill, these attributes of loyalness and helpfulness and friendliness and trustworthiness and being brave and clean, that they would incorporate these things along with biblical ideas into their teachings. And these principles would go on to become incorporated in the Boy Scouts of America. Isn't it interesting? The Boy Scouts of America was founded in 1910 upon these attributes. And almost 110 years later, did you know they filed bankruptcy last year precisely because they got away from their oath of being morally strong and virtuous and honorable, and all the sexual abuse cases in the last few years caused them to file bankruptcy last year as they got away from these ideals that we learn about through moral education. And So anyways, this first cycle of education, the founders really intended, and even James Madison in the Federalist Papers said that our education should perpetuate and improve upon what we, the founders, have given our citizens. And then we get to Alex de Tocqueville in 1830. Now, our country is only about 40 years old at this point, but this author, this Frenchman, and he had a law background, and he would go on to write Democracy in America, was fascinated why this little country was doing so well. So he came over here and spent some time, and he said, "It cannot be doubted that in the United States, the instruction of the people powerfully contributes to the support of the democratic republic, and as such must always be the case, I believe, where the instruction which enlightens the understanding is not separated from their moral education." And he was astonished how well the children understood the Constitution, and how they were studying a little book of questions and answers called the Catechism of America. And look, I'm showing you the Catechism, and it's kind of this Socratic method of asking questions. I would get some of these books. Once again, I'm not trying to sell books, but I'm trying to help you mamas and grandmas build your I Love America library, because you're going to be spending, if you didn't teach these to your kids, it's never too late. I start things with my 14-year-old, and some of my kids are out of the house. I'm always sharing with them what I'm learning. But you are going to have grandchildren that will spend considerable time with you. So instead of, watching the mind-numbing, Disney movies, and I have all those little books, but to be able to have them read a little book out of the reader, or to ask them little questions out of the catechism, I think is just going to make your heart feel like God in heaven. We are trying to continue to perpetuate and improve upon what you gave us. And so the founders' formula for education really propelled through all of America, all aspects, not only in education, but in industry and science and medicine and agriculture. Our whole standard of liberty increased so quickly. So within 100 years of living under the constitutional principles and the free market, even though we were really a relatively small little country, we only held 6% of the world's population, we were now producing over 50% of the world's wealth and goods and services. So you can see, as the world began to take notice and attention of what is going on in America, people were wanting to come here. Students from other countries were wanting to come to be educated here. And we see many other nations felt that there was a brain drain because so many people were wanting to migrate to America in the early 1900s. And so the founding fathers were correct. Both public and private schools in the United States began to provide this universal education that was really rivaled every other nation in the world. And we were one of the newest little countries in the world. So that is our education under the first cycle of what we did right. Within 100 years, people are wanting to now flow to our lands. So we're going to study now what went wrong. This second cycle of education begins. And girls, you're going to start to go, this rings very familiar, because it's almost like this has happened in our lifetime, where we've seen this slide. So now we're going to take a look at the attack that was made against the ideology of our founders. And it was called kind of an experimental implementation of concepts or policies that would have been soundly rejected by our founders because they weren't considered sound. Remember how Benjamin Franklin said, look, we support all sound religion. He wasn't saying only Christians. He was saying these tenets that make up the universal sound religion, that there's a creator, that there is a right and a wrong moral code, that we're going to be judged on how we treat one another, that there's an afterlife, and that we're going to be judged on how we lived our life. And this applies to, all kind of beautiful faiths out there: Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, the Hindu faith, the Buddhist faith. But now we're going to see an experiment against these sound concepts. And for heaven's sake, I lost my page, girls. Okay, so we're going to be introduced to a man by the name of Horace Mann. Have you ever heard of Horace Mann? I mean, there's over 100 schools in this country named after Horace Mann. But once you understand what he did, I would think, people might be petitioning for a name change. But Horace Mann came around in around 1847. So he was actually born in 1796. But this new cycle of education began to emerge. And so about at the same time that the McGuffey readers were developing their little primers, there was a man by the name of Horace Mann. And he began a crusade against the concept of moral education. Now, he was known as the father of public education, and he was a member of the he was a member of Congress from Massachusetts, and he was the president of Antioch College. And, as I did some study online of him, they use a lot of words to describe what he instituted. And if you couldn't really read between the lines and understand what he did, you might not really be very clear on how he contributed to the decline. But just know that he was a student of Karl Marx, who was the father of communism, who was anti-God. And so he was opposed to this stronghold that God had in the school systems. Remember, when our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, the same year that they wrote the Constitution in 1787, they wrote the Northwest Ordinance. And in it, they said that children should be taught three things in school: knowledge, religion, and morality. This is what the founding fathers intended our children to know, that would keep them strong, that would keep them adept as to, the type of government that they were instituting here. And so Horace Mann advocated the idea that the authority and the responsibility of education should actually shift from the parents and shift to the state, and that kids could no longer be held responsible for their natural instincts of behavior, but that we should just be looked upon as all of us are innately good, and that the elite educational establishment should be organized to save our society, and that mankind should be measured by all things, not just God. All right. So whatever the popular trends or the consensus of the feelings are might equate to how education should be dictated. And that children, now this is coming from Horace Mann, that children should be taught that there are no absolute rights or wrongs, that one's decisions are based on particular situations, and hence from that evolves something known as situational ethics, which is not something I want to teach my kids. And so he further stated that what the church had been for a medieval man, old-fashioned, the public schools must become for the democratic and rational man. The God will be replaced by the concept of the public good, and that common schools shall create a more far-seeing intelligence and pure morality than what had been existed in communities of men. And so he continued to promote this kind of educational philosophy and create a non-sectarian school system. So non-sectarian means secular, not religious. And he wanted this new religion with the state as the church and the education of it as its Messiah. So you can see that the conflicts between the founding fathers' original principles of religion and morality were completely contrary to what Horace Mann was beginning to promote around the early 1900s. And And so a new philosophy for a world order began to emerge. Have you ever heard, ladies, of secular humanism? So I want you to know that in the beginning of the humanistic movement, it was a Christian movement in the early about 1478 to the 1500s. And it was this idea in the 14 and 1500s that God intended mankind to find beauty and happiness in this life, not just in the next life. And that the religion humanists wanted to promote the sciences and better architecture and better homes and better relations with each other and within the arts. And this version of humanism was very much embraced by America and our founding fathers. And it sounds good. I always tell my children that Satan, the devil, will tell you 100 truths if he can weave in one little lie. And so, this new version of humanism that Horace Mann, so people were comfortable with the idea of Christian humanism, but Horace Mann now was trying to pull it away from religious humanism and have more of an emphasis on the physical realm, the pleasure rather than just mere happiness. And kind of he's stressing maybe the indulgences of ancient Greece or Rome with the hedonism, I don't think I'm saying that word right, of Greece, though it was just a pursuit of kind of the sensual self-indulgences or the orgies of ancient Rome kind of thing. So it's taking more of a physical realm to your happiness and more kind of steeped in pleasure. So secular humanism, and this is what Horace Mann and another man that's going to come after him, John Dewey, very much believed, that there was no creator, that there were no inalienable rights. Inalienable rights, remember, are our God-given rights from our creator, that there's no fixed standard of morality and there's no divine purpose of life. Man doesn't have a soul, and man has no responsibility to a supreme being for the way he treats other people. There's no future life, and there's not going to be any divine judgment. So completely contrary to, this universal or American religion that our founders wanted, for us to adhere to. And so this idea of secular humanism was tried out in the 1700s, and it was not only depressing, but it was very dangerous in France during the French Revolution. A large group of these secular humanists gained control of the government, and they completely discredited themselves. So when they tried to take over during the French Revolutionary War, and they made atheism the national religion, and they indulged in great excesses of violence and destruction, that the people finally revolted against them and turned the country back over to Napoleon. And so this secular humanism was far less apparent during the 1800s because they remembered how it turned out during the French Revolutionary War. But in the early 1900s, America, there were powerful groups that began to espouse these secular humanistic philosophies and demanded some changes and some significant to the system. Now we have 100 years under our belt, the country's doing so well, but they began to infiltrate in the educational circles. And in these groups began to change the system. The first group was kind of known as populists, and they demanded that the federal government use some of the income taxes to take from the wealthy and to redistribute to the lower classes. And really, we know that happened in the early 1900s with the 16th Amendment, when we instituted the federal income tax, where the government could go directly into your pocketbooks now and take money on taxing people at graduated income levels instead of a uniform tax, which our founders had intended. And then there was another group of wealthy industrial and financial leaders who wanted the federal government to be more forceful in regulating the economy and curtailing competition. And it was very self-serving for their interests. And these were like the Fords and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and the Rothschilds, these kind of master planners. And we're going to talk more about these groups in the fourth section of this seminar. So stay tuned. And then there was a group of people that were opposed to capitalism. They were intrigued with this idea of socialism, of the government having more control and taking care of everybody. And then lastly, there were these groups that were intellectuals who just simply rejected this spiritual and moral foundation of the American formula, and they wanted it eliminated from education. Now, just know it's important to acknowledge that these formulas that these groups started experimenting with were warned by our founding fathers as being destructive to the American system that they had set up. And that's exactly what happened. It began to weaken our country. So now comes along a man by the name of John Dewey. He was another educational reformer, and he was a student of Horace Mann. Horace Mann died, and John Dewey was born in 1859 and died in 1952 at 92. He lived to a ripe old age, unfortunately. But John Dewey studied Horace Mann and was intrigued by this humanism that he was incorporating into the school system. And wouldn't you know, John Dewey, now he is not of the Dewey Decimal System, you know, that we all think of, that great library, old fashioned, it's outdated now almost, but that library classification system. This is not the same Dewey. He taught at Columbia University for 26 years in the early 1900s. And at that time, Columbia University was the only college for teachers. It was called Columbia University was known as Columbia Teachers College. It was the only teachers college in America. He was teaching the teachers of America these concepts. John Dewey would also go on to become the president of the American Humanist Association. And he was known, he touted himself as an atheist, and he signed the Humanist Manifesto with principles that included atheism, evolution, society-based values, immorality, and the acceptability of euthanasia and suicide. And he was teaching our teachers these ideas, these philosophies of the Humanist Manifesto, which he signed. He believed that humanism was actually a religion and that the teachers could be considered prophets. And he goes on to say some of the most outrageous things in the book. Faith in the prayer-hearing God is an unproven and outmoded faith. There is no God, and there is no soul, and there is no room for a fixed natural law or moral absolutes. This is straight from his mouth, who taught at Columbia University for 26 years, you know. And so once Horace Mann's ideas were in place, John Dewey, believing in this messianic character of education, took Mann's philosophies one step further and organized them into an educational delivery system, okay? And so in this effort for him to modernize education, he encouraged the abandonment at what had been at this point the one-room little red schoolhouse, you know, where all the kids were kind of taught together in one room. So what he wanted to do is he promoted this progressive idea of dividing kids into age groups and sending them off to different locations to attend schools. So you now had elementaries, you had junior highs, and you had high schools in all different buildings. And it had this isolating effect on family members from each other. I will never remember about a decade ago when all my kids, I sent them to a private school where all the kids It was kindergarten through high school. And even though they had different classrooms, they would see each other in the hallways. They would see each other at lunch, my children were. So my older kids were telling me, you know, what they saw the younger kids doing and vice versa. And at dinner at night, they would talk about it and they would laugh about different things. And I could see it was cute as they shared their education together. And so it was by design to split the kids up. John Dewey said the two most detrimental things to kids' education progression was, number one, listen to this, mothers. The most detrimental thing was the mother, because he knew mothers had great influence on their children to teach them. And so what he did is he made the days longer at school. So now we have kids are away from home 6, 7, 8 hours. And he also said the second thing that was detrimental to the children's progression in education was God. So you will see, you know, he lived in the mid 1900s, and that's when all the court cases, Supreme Court, where they began to remove prayer from school, remove Bible reading from school, remove, you know, the Lord's Prayer from school. Because how can you control children when their mother has such a strong influence on them? Their primary teachers were their mothers, or when they're looking God for their answers and not to government. And so he broke that up. Isn't that interesting? So he incorporated into the system his own philosophies. He wrote a book in 1916 talking about how to these progressive education ideas. And even progressive liberal educators at the time were kind of in horror of what he was promoting with this progressive education in this book of his, Democracy in Education. In fact, Robert Hutchins, who was known as a liberal educator, said about this new book in 1916 that Dewey had put forth, that the social problems through the educational, he said it's a generous effort. He's trying to solve the social problems through the educational system, but unfortunately the methods he is proposing could not solve these problems. They would merely destroy the educational system. So it's interesting that John Dewey is coming into power and influence in the early 1900s at the same time that the Constitution, the 16th and 17th Amendment in 1913, came to be, that upset the checks and the balances. It's also when the Federal Reserve, when we turned over our money systems to these international banks, and now the education system is starting to be toyed with, in moral education, and God is being taken out of the school systems. And so Dewey looked upon the schools as a wonderful opportunity to indoctrinate the American youth in the virtues of a glorious age where private property, the free market, open competition could be all eliminated. In fact, Dewey went and visited the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and instead of reporting on the wasteland of the revolutionary desolation that was quite widespread at that time in the Soviet Union, he described it as a popular culture impregnated with aesthetic qualities. And so, his intentions were not good. And the philosophies of Horace Mann and John Dewey became really the pillars of this anti-God educational philosophy system that began to take hold in the 1900s. And what a contrast to the ideas of a Bible-based ideals that were a part of our founding. And so, at this time, implementing this humanism in the classroom was still being resisted by many Americans, but something happened in the mid 1900s that distracted many of the citizens from kind of the traditional education in this God-centered base, and it was World War II. So what happened is men went off to war, women came out of the homes into the factories, and then after the war, a lot of the soldiers and sailors and airmen had this GI Bill that would pay for college. And so there was a more demand for this post-war education, and adult education programs expanded. And then something happened that I didn't really understand the impact it had on education. But in 1957, the Russians beat America into space with the launch of the first satellite called the Sputnik in 1957. Have you ever heard of that? The Sputnik? Well, what happened is it caused Americans to think that we were falling behind with our education, that we needed more math and more science. And so this fear that the communists were getting ahead of us, and it was kind of at the height of the Cold War too, where this sentiment that it was better to be dead than red, the communist red, that we were now willing to let the federal government have more of a role in our education with our children because we thought we were falling behind. Interesting enough, it was propaganda to some degree because it was American technology, and it was actually Americans that went over to Russia and launched that satellite. And, people will say they did that so they could fundamentally begin to change the way we educate. So what they did is they began to take the emphasis on history and God and those kind of things out of the school system and just teach more science and math and reading. And so when you begin to take out God and history and our founding fathers, what eventually begins to creep in? Well, anti-God, anti-religion, anti-founding fathers. And this is exactly what began to happen. And even though, and then you had the 1960s where you have civil rights unrest and integrated schools, and more women were going to work now. And so you were seeing latchkey kids and TV dinners, and nutrition was, and kids were now TV. I mean, TV was trying to promote this narrative that there's a generation gap. Your parents don't really understand you. And so, I think many parents in the 60s began to feel very uneasy about this anti-family, anti-God focus that was beginning to permeate into the educational system. And girls, it's something so interesting. Last week, I don't know if you heard, but there's a private school in Manhattan just last week, Grace Church School. It's Episcopal school. Sorry for anyone that's Episcopal. And I know you probably don't espouse or agree with what this private school has done in Manhattan. $57,000 a year to send your child to the school. And they are no longer going to be using the words mom or dad or parent, because they say that this kind of language is exclusive, and we don't know, we can't make assumptions about children's home lives, and those aren't welcoming phrases anymore to call a mom or a dad or a parent. So they're no longer allowed to use those terms. You will call them grown-ups, folks, family, or guardians. Can you imagine that? So 60 years have passed from the 1960s, when we now allowed government, for fear of we were falling behind, to begin to intervene. Now we can't even, we're seeing this experiment of this private school. And I told my husband, any family who is sending a child to elementary school for $57,000, you know that there's some real stability in that home. There's probably a mother and a father, and yet these parents are willing to pay $57,000 but not have them, be identified as their father and mother. So, as a result of this experimental cycle, also, let's go back to the 60s now for a minute. We see the hippie lifestyles, the flower children, the drugs, the music, anti-God, atheism. So you get to about the mid 80s and people are fully aware that something is not right, and they want to return to the basics of the first 100 years. And the educational foundation, it said, of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity. This was the US Department of Education in 1983. And the findings of this commission was 23 million American adults were functionally illiterate. About 13% of all 17-year-olds in the United States were considered functionally illiterate. And the average achievement of high school students on most standardized tests was lower now than when the Sputnik was launched in 1957. And so are actually, with all the reforms that, that took place under that Sputnik, thinking we're falling behind, we are actually lower now. For a first world country, we used to be at the top. Now we're in the middle and even at the bottom for many of these testings. And 1/4 of all mathematic classes in college are remedial mathematic classes. And so, we can see a strong drive was mounted to use the governmental agencies to completely secularize all phases of public education and what has come from taking God out of the classrooms. We saw last week when the Supreme Court began to eliminate these court cases in the mid-60s of prayer and Bible reading, what it did, and how the teaching of spiritual values and morality being eliminated from schools was completely opposite of what our founders intended in the Northwest Ordinance. And those stories with those little moral lessons in the McGuffey readers, if you look, there's a little chart here. They did a study of fourth grade readers from 1810 to 1950. And out of 25 pages of the readers in 1810, 16 of those 25 pages reflected some sort of moral lesson. All right. And then you look at 1910, only 4 pages out of the 25 pages had little moral lessons in the readers. And you look at 1960, the readers that children in fourth grade are being taught to read, 0 moral lessons. And so no more 10 commandments or little biblical stories they're learning as they're reading now. And what do we see here? Well, I'll tell you what we see. We went from teaching American history and civics to social studies. So civics is really a study of how to be a good citizen and how we interact, what is our role in the government as a citizen. So we went from teaching civics to all my kids just called it, and even me, we called it social studies, which is merely just a study of human interactions in societies and cultures. I saw this 11 years ago when we moved our 5 kids at that time, to Hood River, Oregon. And we had children in middle school, and they had just purchased this huge big ball, which was the world. And it was right in front of the school. And I thought, that is so interesting, as they were trying to emphasize 11 years ago, kind of the global humanity or the global citizenship. And really, I think, de-emphasizing the American exceptionalism or the specialness of this country when you focus on our global citizenship instead of our citizenship as a United States citizen. And, I think it's no wonder that we're seeing so many young people today that don't revere America. You might even say they hate America. They think our founders were racists or degenerates or perverts, because as we stop talking about, American history and the miracle of America and those stories in our founders, and just focused, on more anti-God and the basics, as you can see, we have children that are not feeling patriotic. We have children. It's so interesting. This morning, I have a 13-year-old daughter in 7th grade. She goes to a private school, an all-girls Catholic school. And we were talking about how kids, we didn't used to pledge of allegiance in Oregon. And she said, Mom, we don't say the pledge either in our school. And I clutched my bosom and I said, I'm paying several thousands of dollars a month and you don't pledge in your private school. And then she said, but Mom, we do say a prayer before every class. And I thought, whew. But I said, honey, ask your teachers, why don't you pledge? And I am going to ask the teachers, why are we not pledging allegiance to our country and to God in our schools? And I think, that as the Constitution has been kind of presented as a boring or uninteresting or outdated to our children in the school systems, you know, so much can be written about the founding fathers, which leveled serious charges. Oh, that's another thing. Serious charges have been leveled against our founding fathers in the school systems, you know. Isn't it interesting in the 1990s when Clinton came out with Monica Lewinsky and all that scandal in the White House is exactly the same time when Thomas Jefferson and his illegitimate children with Sally Heming, that all came to light. And I think it was all by design. If you can attack the founders' personalities and their character and their reputation, if you can begin to think, well, look, Thomas Jefferson had, you know, affairs and dalliances with women. If someone like Thomas Jefferson, if it was okay, then it's probably not so bad that Clinton is doing what he was doing. So if you can just kind of see this is all done by design. So girls, we just have one more page to go so you can see that, you know, we went from strong local government with strong, you know, little school boards dictating what our children are being taught to just delegating it to the federal government. If I could just remind you again to watch that Tale of Two Constitutions YouTube video by the Thomas Jefferson Center. It's in two parts. It's an 8-minute video, talks about how the Constitution was intended to be, and then how the attacks on the Constitution and what we have now. And it kind of also talks about the attacks on the education, the Tale of Two Constitutions. I really recommend that to you. And we can see how there was a shift away from the free market economy with an overreach of the Commerce Clause. We talked about this before in Article 1, and how our taxes went from being low to very high when the government now had a federal income tax. You know, now they can have all kinds of programs. In the Butler case, the Supreme Court of 1936 that said, oh yeah, using the preamble general welfare clause, we can now begin to tax and spend for whatever purposes. So, you know, the general welfare or specific welfare of certain groups can be taken care of. That was a Supreme Court decision. So some of these Supreme Court decisions have really amended the Constitution through their judicial legislation. And our debt has gone, we're $30 trillion. And with the stimulus money hitting people's bank accounts this week, I think, you know, where it would be about $85,000 a person that we would owe out of the 320 million citizens to pay off our debt. And so you can see how these things have happened in our country, and this education of removing God and putting a more of a secular slant and how our history is not being taught. And also a lot of bad things happened in the early 1900s. We were taken off the gold and the silver standard, and that was done by design too. And I could tell you a little bit more about that, but I don't, I'm out of time, but I will weave that in, what exactly that meant for our country. And so, you know, with all these negative things happening in our country, emerging from these experiments of the last 150 years, there has been a majority of people waking up and wanting some reform. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons a man by the name of Donald Trump won in 2016, a man who never held office, but that people were just tired and worried and sick and tired of what had happened to our country. And so we see that first cycle, how we prospered in the first 100 years, and then this second cycle of anti-God, anti-family, anti-religion, and what has been kind of the product of that. And now as we enter into this third cycle, where, you know, we've learned from experience that we better appreciate and want to value and want to learn what our founding fathers gave us. And so, you know, the greatness of America is a reality, but the door is becoming dangerously unhinged. Next week, we're going to talk about the assault on the moral fiber of America. Now, girls, I know class today is a little heavy. You know, this seminar is not meant to depress us, but it is kind of chilling, as I think we recognize that some of these things are happening right on our watch. but we can't fix something that we don't really know how it got broke. And you need to know there was a concerted effort on the parts of people that don't love God and don't love America and don't love freedom to make some fundamental changes. And I hope you began to see how that happened and to understand how that happened in our education systems. So what can we do? We can always get involved. We can, cute little Samantha on our call, I'm not sure if you're on our call today, is running for the school board. Moms, you could run for the school board. Now, if that seems like a little bit of a tall order, guess what I did for years in my home to kind of counter some of the falsehoods that I felt my kids were being exposed to in school. And my kids have gone to public school, they've gone to private school, I have homeschooled my kids, but every morning I would have a little devotional before I'd get the kids off to school, and we would study scripture, and we would teach them a story or a miracle of America, and teach them the story of our founding fathers. And we would read the headlines. I still do this with my one child left. We read the headlines of the newspaper because I want to be able to counter some of the nonsense that is being touted as news. I want them to hear it from my mouth first. And then we sing a little biblical song, a little gospel. We get on our knees in the kitchen on the floor, and I hold her little hand and we pray, and I get that child off to school each day. And that has spoken some peace to my heart as I send them out in the world and don't always know that what they're being taught is correct. And so, and I even with the kids that are gone now, the 26-year-old, 23, 21, I send a little text devotional about almost every day. And I send a little quote, inspiring quote, sometimes from our founders, and then a little scripture from the Bible. And then I write my little personal witness of it in text. And then I'll just tell them what mama and dad are doing and send some pictures. And so I just feel to do that, to try and shore my kids up when they're exposed to things that is just crap. No better word for it than crap. And so, God will inspire you what you can do with your little children and your grandchildren to shore them up. Because, I know at times it seems like, geez, this nation is on the verge of crumbling. What can I do? And as you talk to God that way, he will let you know what to do. And I really believe it will be the mothers and the grandmothers and families who are trying, that we will be the staff upon which the nation will lean when it seems like we're on the brink of ruin and people don't know what to do. God has said, look, this nation will endure. Thomas Jefferson said these principles in the Declaration are going to be eternal principles. But, this is why it's so important that we learn these things so that we can remain anchored in hope when everyone around us is, thinking that everything's going to pot and they're losing their minds and worry and anxiety. We might see some sweeping crisis. We saw COVID. Was that a man-made crisis, man-made plague? I don't know. It might seem like it was, but we will see natural disasters and political crisis, fraudulent elections, ruling elites, over oppressive governments. I think my husband said the other day, Jolene, we're only 5 seats in Congress for Republicans taking over again. And Biden has only been in office 8 weeks. And it looks like we probably will take the Senate and the House in a year and a half. So I think people are waking up, and that's good. Let's get a body of leaders that are more saturated in constitutional principles that want to rally us back, but more so than even Congress and our political leaders. I believe it will be the righteous families, not perfect families, but families that revere God, that are looking to him for help and guidance, and that are staying close, and that are learning the wisdom of our founding fathers. It will be those families that the nation will lean upon when things get particularly bad. And as we're doing these things, as you show up each week, as you're learning these ideas and you're sharing them with your husband and sharing them with your children, God will place in your heart what you should do next month or next year or 2 years as we continue to meet and study. So that is our lesson today. I hope you're not too bummed out about how some of this has transpired. Please go back and read it word for word, because I give you kind of an overview, and I don't always, use every quote and bit of material in this lesson, but go back and read it again and ask God what you can do to counter some of these false educational ideas that your children, your grandchildren are going to be exposed to. So anyways, with that, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much, and we will see you next week.